Nationalism is something we brushed by a little bit as we've talked about things. We've talked about how Wales is changing from being a part of England and a part of Britain, as it's called later, and how post Owen Glyndwr, we saw what I would call the accommodation of Wales, wherein Wales was brought into the upper echelons as far as the king, his retinue, all of the various leaders of the country. And in doing so, it eliminated the respect that was there, or at least the understanding of the former laws, the former governments, and the eventual homogenizing of British imperial rule into one rule located effectively just in London. And it starts really at the end of the 1800s as you have Ireland, for example, starting to push back against this rule and the idea that they deserve to have their own version of home rule. And you see things like that starting to advance in places like Wales, certainly not to the same degree, certainly not with the same sense of organization or understanding, but it's definitely developing at this point. And today we're going to talk a little bit about one aspect of this change. Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 258, The National Voice. There is a moment at the end of a meeting when speeches are done and the teacups have been cleared away, and somebody almost always, without ask, starts the first note of a song. Not a performance, not a concert, just a shared instinct, a reason to sing. I remember, and I can use my own personal example in this. I used to be a churchgoer back many years ago. And one of the things that would happen at the end, if there was someone who was leaving the community, especially if they were leaving Wales, they would actually have them come to the front of the congregation and they would actually sing a song to them. And about, in this case, it was Keep a Welcome. And it would all be about, how when they return again, there will always be people waiting for you, keeping the light on. There's always a welcome in Wales when you return. And I can tell you that song always stood out to me, and it always kind of makes me a little emotional when I hear it, simply because of that feeling that I got in that moment and the feeling I got when we would sing it to other people, but also when my family and I left Wales and they sang it to us, and how much that meant to me as an individual. So you can imagine that it just shows how I would argue that Wales has always maintained this musical affinity, this concept of song and poetry being just as important to the community as any political movement, as any civil control had ever been. It becomes a way that brings the Welsh together. I remember, as another example, famously, Michael Myers in an episode of his where he's in Swansea, and I unfortunately cannot remember the name of the show now. And he is introducing various comedians, but he starts off by talking about the area and kind of his experience. And he basically starts up singing the first line of Bread of Heaven, and then everybody in the arena is singing Bread of Heaven. And his comments were that would never happen in England because we would never just suddenly pick up and sing a random rugby hymn just because you started singing it. He said that's the thing about Wales. It's like now all of a sudden everybody's singing it. And that concept and that idea, certainly, we're generalizing, we're giving it sort of a structure that maybe it's not as thorough as what that sounds like. But I do think there is some truth to it. And I think because there's truth to it, I think it's something that we should always remember. Wales At the end of the day, its instinct was always to think about things from a communal voice based opinion. And song is nothing if not communal based, especially when you have choirs and that kind of thing where it's a group singing and you feel that unity through song. When people sang together, they were also practicing belonging. They rehearsed memory. They turned culture into a quiet but persistent form of political opinion. Between 1900 and 1914, Wales was not simply becoming modern. Wales was arguing about what modernity meant to them and whether it had to come at the cost of the Welsh language, Welsh institutions, and Welsh identity, importantly. Some of the arguments that happened in Parliament through bills, speeches, and legislation, some of that argument happened in parliaments through bills, speeches, and legislation. Some of it happened in newspapers, in chapels, and in reading rooms. And some of it happened in verse, in voice, and in shared choruses. This episode, of course, will examine the cultural influences that were calling for a separate Wales, or at least a Wales more confidently distinct. It follows songs and the reputations that they gathered, the poets, the writers who carried national ideas forward, and the way cultural awakening and political revival fed one another in the years immediately before World War I. Now, I will say, normally this would be a great place to put in music. I don't want to get into a copyright situation, especially on YouTube, so I'm not going to do that. But I'll try my best to at least point out particular musicians, particular writers, and suggest you check them out because honestly, that is one way to give them the due that they are deserved. By 1900, the idea of Wales as a nation was not new, but it was changing shape. The 19th century had already produced fierce debates about education, language, and respectability. It had created a thriving Welsh language press, a modern national eisteddfodau, political movements that flirted with home rule, and a nonconformist culture that both intensely was local and deeply international through migration and diaspora. The early 20th century sharpened these forces. It brought a growing sense that culture itself could act as a national infrastructure. Songs were no longer just about the hearts and the chapels, but also about public spaces. Poetry was not merely artistic, but representative. Welshness increasingly appeared as something organized, defended, and asserted. Wales was also becoming more visible as national questions within the British politics began to become important. During a debate in the House of Lords in 1911, one speaker acknowledged the limits of the legislation when it came to identity, in words that are strikingly precise because they treat Welshness as politically real. Quote, "We are told that an Act of Parliament can do anything, but there is one thing an Act of Parliament cannot do, and that is convert a Welshman into an Englishman. The four nations in this kingdom remain separate, as they were at the beginning. Now we are confronted with a new phenomenon, namely a Welsh nationality, which has become more and more accentuated." End quote. That statement does not create Welsh nationality. It doesn't reflect validly what the Welsh nationality was, but it does admit a growing intensity, and it recognizes that something cultural was becoming unavoidable. If culture was becoming political, music was one of its most powerful tools. Before radio, songs crossed class lines, literacy levels, and regions. In societies shaped by heavy industry and movements, singing created a shared emotional experience. By the early 20th century, the national anthem, Land of My Fathers, Hen Wlad Fy Nadau, had become more than a patriotic composition. It was the language of land, ancestry, and belonging, which allowed people to articulate Welsh identity instinctively without argument. Welsh newspapers showed this repeatedly. A report in Y Trist from January 1906 describes a chapel gathering in Cardiff ending the way that it required no explanation. The meeting ends with an anthem, and the congregation unites in the chorus. That is not framed as a political gesture, yet it does function as one. It is public rehearsal of national identity. What is equally revealing is how Welshness traveled. In April of 1910, Cymru ar Celtlladain reported a farewell meeting at Battersea Rise. The report notes that the local composer presented a two-part song entitled Fi Anwyl Walad and Rin Caru Cymru. The performance is described as sweet and effective, and once again, the gathering concluded with a national anthem. Even in London, which London for you that might know Welsh, identity is curated through language and song. Culture had become portable and a part of the homeland away. Institutions such as the National Eisteddfodau made this cultural nationalism visible and organized. It functioned as a symbolic parliament, a space where Wales debated itself through poetry, adjudication, and ceremony. It defined what counted as Welsh culture while simultaneously reinforcing continuity with a deeper historical past. St. David's Day celebrations played a similar role. A report in the Goliad describes a gathering ending once again with the national anthem. The writer explicitly frames remembrance as a duty and stated that it was the obligation of all of them to keep the memory of St. David alive amongst the people. The language of obligation here matters. Culture is not presented as nostalgia, but as a responsibility, and a responsibility that implies ownership. Poetry, meanwhile, provided meaning as well as memory. In the early 20th century, Welsh poets were public figures. Their works circulated widely and were quoted in papers and spoken at public events. Older voices were republished and reframed to serve the modern national argument. In Gwaith Minneithog, edited in association with Owen M. Edwards, the poem Canau Cymru includes the line that links land, language, and unity. The poem does not lament decline, it asserts revival. Sunlight is rising on language and land, and people unite to praise them together. That is nation-making in verse. The cultural nationalism did not erase division. Wales remained linguistically, religiously, and socially complex, but shared culture created a framework within which diversity could still feel collective. Welsh newspapers amplified this sense of everyday nationhood. They reported not only politics, but routine rhythms of Welsh cultural life. Meetings held, songs sung, lectures delivered, prizes awarded, and over time this repetition normalized the idea of Wales as a coherent public sphere. In these reports, Welshness is never explained, it is assumed. Readers are expected to recognize song titles, understand references, and feel implicated in the shared responsibility. Parliamentary debates, too, increasingly reflected this reality. During the 1913 debate on the Established Church Wales Bill, speakers spoke explicitly about Welsh language and nationality as a political force. One speech argued that Welsh culture had been targeted historically for political reasons. Quote, they thought the Welsh language, the Welsh nationality, the Welsh spirit, Welsh literature, so they used the church as a means of destroying the Welsh language and Welsh nationality purely for political purposes. Another passage described the emotional depth of the linguistic attachment. Quote, the Welsh language is enshrined in the hearts and affection of the people of Wales. End quote. These statements matter because they acknowledge the Welsh nationality was something real, something that could be weakened or defended, something that had political consequence. And that is critical. When people spoke of a separate Wales before 1914, they did not always mean full independence. For some, it meant merely administrative autonomy. For others, cultural self determination. For many, it meant recognition, the right to be Welsh without apology. Cultural revival made these demands imaginable. If Wales could sustain national festivals, national songs, national literature, and a national press, then it could imagine national institutions as well. This confidence extended beyond Wales itself. Diaspora communities maintained identity through the same cultural tools, music, language, and organized gatherings. A London report listed song titles such as Fi Anwyl Walad and Rhin Cawri Cymru, and these were showing that Welshness was not defined by geography. It was something worth reporting on. As 1914 approached, Welsh cultural life was intensely future-facing. There was a sense of building and naming, of preparing Wales for a more confident century. The war would, of course, interrupt this process, as would the poverty of the Depression and then the next war, but it would not erase this movement. From 1900 to 1914, Wales was already doing the work of nationhood, in choirs, in newspapers, in festivals, in poetry, in the simple repeated acts of communal song. Even Parliament acknowledged the limits of power over identity. Quote, an act of Parliament cannot convert a Welshman into an Englishman, as we said earlier. That admission marks a turning point. Culture had become structural. Welshness had become unavoidable. You couldn't simply merge into a blancmange of being an English person any more than you could turn someone from another continent into an English person just by saying you need to follow these instructions. Before 1914, Welsh culture was not merely reflective, it was generative. It produced shared language, shared symbols, and a shared confidence. It made Wales imaginable as a political subject because it made Wales real in everyday life. And sometimes that's really as simple as meetings ending and a congregation uniting in a chorus of a song that reminds them of home, that brings back that concept of Wales as a place, as a land, not just simply as a people. Now, I just wanted to end this particular episode by talking a little bit about some of those who make up the people in Wales that were writing songs, that were performing songs, that were publishing essays or publishing poems, and why they were important to Wales, what they brought, and who they were. So we're just going to start initially with some of the writers. First one on the list is Bariah Gweneffe Evans, who is a poet, an essayist, and nonconformist minister whose work linked the Welsh language, ethics, and national responsibility. His essays in the Cymru magazine argued that language was central to the people's moral survival. A man who's not unfamiliar from past discussions, T. Gwyn Jones, was a key figure in modernizing Welsh poetry, blending classical meters with contemporary themes. He helped carry Welsh verse into the 20th century without abandoning the traditions that had gone before. Eleanor Jenkins was one of the most important Welsh women writers of this period, whose novels explored rural life, nonconformity, and the tension between tradition and change in a period where tradition was being held very strong, but change was coming hard. We mentioned him earlier. Owen M. Edwards was an editor, a historian, a cultural organizer who popularized Welsh history and literature through accessible prose, school texts, and literary editions such as the Gwaith Menthog that we mentioned earlier. Of the musicians, composers, and the musical culture in Wales at the time, of course, we can't bring any of this up without talking about choirs, because, of course, the male choirs and their voices were something of a phenomenon at this time. To give you an example out of something I already know without having to refer to a document. When the Mormon community in America migrated to where they ended up in Utah, one of the things that happened was they had a great migration from Wales of converts. And some of those converts brought with them their choral traditions, and that the moral that it's because of them that the Mormon Tabernacle Choir exists, because they carried out their tradition of singing hymns in a massive choir. And it now no longer is a strictly male choir, but it is a massive thing, something that for many, many years was massively respected across the world and featured quite frequently on radio and television. And so they still have influence, even to a lesser extent today. But it was started by the Welsh people who were bringing their culture to a new location and continuing that culture. So it's something to remember, I guess, is what I'm saying. And it's an important composition, an important part of seeing how Wales continued to grow. Now, Joseph Parry was a composer of the Welsh national anthem, Land of Our Fathers, Pen Wlad Fi Nadau, whose work bridged chapel music and national expression. By the early 1900s, his music was inseparable from the Welsh public identity. Now, as examples of some of the Welsh hymns of the day, we have Celon Lan, a hymn emphasizing moral purity and inner worth, resonating deeply with nonconformist values of the day and the Welsh ethical self-image. Cumronda, which was, of course, composed in 1907, it quickly became one of the most recognizable Welsh hymn tunes associated with strength, endurance, and collective self-image and collective voice. Guide Me, Thou, O Great Redeemer, an English anthem, is known in Welsh as Argelwydd Arwain Trir Analwych, and it links Welsh religious traditions to global Protestant culture while remaining deeply national feeling. And it is a very popular song. I mean, I heard it long before I knew of Welsh music. So it is definitely something that sticks with me, even though the title is slightly different in the one I've known. Now, of course, all of these voices are just bare examples. You could probably find much better ones than that. But just to give you a kind of an idea of some of those composers, some of those authors, and some of the songs that were involved. And you'll note some things about it. One, obviously, a lot of them are religious. Welsh hymn singing and choirs kind of all go together with religion, so it makes sense that they would be popular because of that. The idea and concepts around choir singing, which becomes popular in the valleys and in the coal areas in and around South Wales, definitely has its roots in that concept. So it makes sense that it would become bigger and bigger as time went on. Much like, if you think of it, the way music changes over time, and it sort of becomes different than what it was before. A lot of songs that have different meanings at one time have maybe not completely different meaning, but hold a different place later on in their lives and their existence. Quite frequently, for example, so-called national anthems didn't start that way. They started as somebody writing a poem and then became the song that everybody attached to a particular type of music. And quite often that music existed for a different song entirely. And as a, you know, there's a number of examples of this. This was very common, especially in past times where music was kind of flexible in how it was used. So if you had a good tune, you would just align it with a good poem and wham, you suddenly had a national anthem. All of these things are developing during this period, and formalizing all of this comes even stronger as we start to get things like records and radio and eventually television, which will reinforce all of this and bring forward even more of the cultural ideas of the day. And I think it's important that a lot of these voices, at least even now, at this point, are Welsh speaking voices. They're not necessarily strictly English speaking Welsh people. And I think that's important as well. Certainly, we're getting to that stage. We're definitely going to have that too, and more as time goes on. But for now, we definitely have still this pocket of Welsh culture, Welsh language, and Welsh association that is all wrapped up into this culture of singing, of poetry, of myth making that is going on in Wales, as it is really in a lot of other countries across the world at this time. And I think this sort of helps to explain why Wales never felt like it wasn't a country, I think, for the most part. It was more that the country side of it had ceased to be the important side of it. It was the people, not the place at that time. But over time, it also became the place. It also became the location, the boundaries, the borders, the firm understanding of where Wales was in the world, where Cymru was now the word that people were talking about instead of talking strictly of Wales. The whole concept of this starts to boil over in this period. And with the rise of the Labour Party, will continue to be an important portion of it, even while the Labour Party is more focused on workers and on worker rights and on the political side of the worker existence. There is still this popularity in Wales because it also represents a lot of the national feelings of Wales. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we go forward and continue to talk about the foundations of so much change in Britain in this period leading up to World War I and how it influences and reflects so much of society at that time. But with all that said and done, I'd like to thank you all for listening, watching, viewing, however you do. And you can, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on any social media at Welsh History Pod, except, of course, Facebook, which is facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. If you'd like to help the podcast with research, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. I appreciate every contribution. I appreciate your help. And I look forward to actually beginning some projects this year, which you'll see probably starting in the summer. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you're looking forward to that. And with all that said and done, thank you once again. We'll talk to you later. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.